Yeah. It is now 3:25, and so I resume the hearing. I don't think that there's going to be any need for introductions. I think we all know who we all are at this point. Hopefully we do anyway. So I'll turn then to site ST8, that's policy SS10. Land north of Monk's Cross. Yes. I'll, as previously, I'll look to the council in the first instance, and just so that the council is aware, I am as interested in the relationship between the site and the other part of the inner boundary to the west. Yes. Basically, I'm interested in the slither of Greenbelt.
It's the main issue between us, of course. Well, all I'll say about it, because others know more about these things than I do, you've got in the Statement of Common Ground areas of agreement and disagreement. We've got a number of agreed modifications to the key principles and the policy criteria on page 5 and 6. And the main issue, of course, we've got a Secretary of State decision awaited. Apparently it's due on the 4th of August. Great timing. And let's hope that the new team can get it through. But subject to that, the main issue, as you already identified, is the land to the west. And I'm going to leave that to Jane and to deal with the Greenbelt issue relating to the west, if that's convenient. Thank you.
So in terms of the Greenbelt for site ST8, the summary of the assessment of that is provided in EXCYC 59D. The summary is Appendix 3, page 453. Within that, it explains the potential harm to Greenbelt, how it's been looked at, and how mitigation has been dealt with, including taking the boundary back from the outer ring road. It also talks about how the site looks to preserve the compactness and rural setting of the city by moving it back from the outer ring road, which, as we've discussed previously, is a particularly important factor for purpose 4, the historic setting from Greenbelt purposes as interpreted for York. But on the point you particularly raised in relation to the Green Wedge, this also explains that the development's been stepped back from Huntingdon, creating a new Green Wedge to the west of the site. And that is in order to safeguard the setting and the distinct identity of Huntingdon. Indeed, on page 445 of that document, it does talk about if development were allowed across the entirety of the area, it would result in the coalescence of the separate districts and loss of identity, as well as rural setting.
Why would that be a problem?
It's identified earlier on that that area is a distinct character from the rest of the city, and looking to maintain the separation of those different neighbourhoods. It also follows the urban form of the rest of York, as we talked about last week in relation to green wedges, which include in some instances strays. and Ings. Was it yesterday?
It was yesterday, not last week.
Forgive me.
It gets to you like that.
Yeah, sorry, go on. Did I interrupt you?
No, that was answering your question.
Right, so is there, again, I mean, these are very similar questions, to be honest, to the ones that I had in relation to ST7. I think you're telling me that in this instance, there's something distinct about Huntington, I should say. What?
It's the separation of the different neighbourhoods per se, rather than about Huntington specifically, sir, which follows the urban form of separation that York has as a whole, which is then reflected in how the assessment in relation to what's been set out for purpose 4.
Well, if we take purpose 4 out of the equation for a moment, just to help me illustrate my point, separation of neighbourhoods wouldn't be a greenbelt purpose.
Indeed, as I
when we look at the other four purposes, but so what you are saying is it's not those other purposes, it's purpose 4. Which is about the historic setting of the city.
It's the historic form of the city, and as I understand, sirs, you said that in the application of the 5 purposes of Greenbelt, if you look at purpose 2, that wasn't necessary because it was considered within purpose 4, and this is how that is then taken forward with purpose 4.
Yeah, sorry, remind me, which is purpose 2?
The merging of settlements. So if you were looking in other locations, typically this might come up under a purpose 2 matter, but because it is fundamental to the urban form and the historic fabric of York as a city, it's treated in this instance under purpose 4. I hope that
so that's
clarify.
a matter of principle then, rather than there being something special about this particular area.
Absolutely.
And if I can just chip in, again, it's another matter. As you know, historic England is particularly concerned and has raised the same points with ST7, ST15 as well. And you'll find the reference to ST8 in its Reg 19 reps CD14C, SID 118, PDF pages 117 to 8, where they make the points about making sure that this allocation doesn't come too close to the ring road and is drawn back. And it's much the same type of point as they're making with regard to ST7, but obviously related to this location. And if you'd like my favourite reference point, the Reg 19 Strategic Sustainability Appraisal, CD9B, that is at pages I-77 and I-78 in Appendix I, and it's PDF pages 96 to 97, which reflects the heritage impact assessment and the concerns of Natural England. Having dusted it down earlier today, I just felt I ought to keep it open. Thank you.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, sir. Well, you're absolutely right. As a starting point, is that the difference between us is this point about whether or not this is greenbelt. And in my opinion, I think this, if we're not too careful, we're going to make a mockery of how we address greenbelt in York. I think the starting point to this is, what is ST8 meant to be? Well, first of all, we're told it's an urban extension. It's not like the others that we discussed, the one that was discussed yesterday, which is meant to be a standalone settlement. ST8 is an urban extension that takes advantage of the existing facilities within Huntington. It takes advantage of the fact that Huntington's got schools, whether it's primary school, secondary school, post office and shops. And whilst some of these services are provided additionally on the site itself because of its scale, is that everything about ST8 is about walking distances and walking routes back into Huntington. I don't quite understand the reference to be separate from Huntington as a neighbourhood, because it was my understanding that this would in fact be more Huntington. I don't think we're actually giving it a separate settlement name. It won't have its own identity. To some extent, yes, it'll be designed in to look like a village and adopt the principles of a village, but ultimately it is a urban extension. And I think on that point, I'd like to look at maybe some of the language that's used through the various documents, without taking you to necessarily all the little bits of paperwork that are already in front of us. The CYC 59D, the Greenbelt Annex, at page 449, tells us why it is required to have a separation between the existing and the new development to protect and replicate the city's current development pattern and evolution. Well, if you go and see the site along its eastern boundary, what you'll see is some 1960s council housing more or less all the way down the boundary. You're not actually seeking to protect anything of any note within this urban extension. It's not as if you're abutting a conservation area. You've got the backs of housing more or less all the way down. And as I follow on to page 450, it talks about the district character and the strategic green space in the form of a new green wedge. Now, at this point, and it also goes to talk about a green corridor within that same set of bullet points. And the point I make about language is, I've got green wedge and I've got green corridor on page 450. As I then take it to the local plan text itself, under SS10, and I don't necessarily need to take you there, sir, but you'll be able to just jot this down as a reference. Paragraph 3.51 talks about a green corridor, and item 4 within the policy itself talks about a green wedge. Now, if this is about creating a buffer for the existing residents in the form of a green wedge or a green corridor, I get that. And to some extent, in the master plan that we've submitted as part of the public inquiry, and the master plan is copied to and appended to my statement and the statement of common ground, I have a problem in that the master plan has got a green wedge and a green corridor across the southern part of the proposal, in the sense we use the area for public recreation area, and in addition we're using it also for the new primary school. The problem I also have with the council's suggestion and along the southern edge is that we actually introduce a new greenbelt boundary where it doesn't exist, so there is currently no defensible boundary, and yet we install a boundary to partially separate what's part of the master plan in locations that make no sense whatsoever. So in effect, the requirement to put a defensible boundary in actually doesn't lead to a better master plan. It actually leads to separation. And in effect, it chops off bits of field that then serve no purpose whatsoever. We've not been given an answer as to what we're meant to do with the land in the green wedge. I think my final point, sir, and again, it's within my statement, is that if we're talking about historic character and historic views and separation, I think if you were to go to North Lane and then look down this green wedge isn't actually a continuous view. It steps in and out and comprises a series of small fields. At best, it's 180 metres wide, and at its most narrowest point, it's 80 metres wide. You can't see down it all the way, and therefore it becomes a sort of a series of zigzaggy pony paddocks that actually serve no purpose, because you've actually got no access to half of these small fields once you've chopped them off. So my request all along in this planning process is to maybe revisit the language of green wedge, green corridor, create a bit of a buffer between the existing urban edge. It doesn't need to be 180 metres wide, but there is an opportunity to fill some of this in with lower density development. And to the southern half of the site, we're not proposing any more development. We're not proposing any more housing. What we're asking is that don't make it green belt, because it actually makes for poor planning. The master plan and the design of what we've got already will be somewhat disrupted by the introduction of a green belt boundary. So this is not necessarily about needing more houses, although the top 4 paddocks would certainly allow you to get a little bit more housing. It just overall doesn't make any sense as a green belt constraint when we could use other language. And I think that's the nub of my case there.
Thank you. Just a couple of things to help clarify. On page 450, which Mr Johnson referred to, where it talks about green corridor, a green wedge on green corridors, I believe the green corridor relates to the design of the development, so would be within the allocation, as opposed to the green wedge, which is the area that we're discussing, just to clarify on those two. Also, just to make it clear, obviously, that green wedge as a green belt designation will be a land use designation rather than an environmental designation, as is always the case with green belt. And on the point about boundary...
Forgive me, I didn't understand that second point.
So green belt is a land use designation rather than an environmental designation.
And what's a green wedge?
So the green wedge in this instance would form part of the green belt. The green wedge would form part of the green belt. Whereas the green corridor that's referred to at page 450 would not be green belt and would be within the design of the development as it states on page 450. And in terms of the boundaries, are you happy for me to move on to that? Yep. So Mr Johnson's right, there is, as is often the case, a small part of the boundary which is not recognisable and permanent features. That is only a small part, the vast majority of it does. It's part, the southern part of boundary 27A. The reason for that is if you followed around, you would end up even closer to Huntington itself. So it is proposed that the master planning of the site would be to create a recognisable and permanent feature along there to create that final bit of missing boundary, if you like. I'm not sure if Miss Bartle is going to talk about the settlements.
Nor is she.
Yes, sorry, my brain is now engaged. There was a suggestion that we were unclear on whether this was an urban extension or or how this was being related as an urban extension to either the western developed or the developed area to the west of the site. Well, it isn't. It's deliberately not meant to be an extension of Huntington, hence the reason for that separation. We consider it an extension to the north of Monk's Cross, and I say that because in earlier iterations of the plan, this was looked at, and we considered it necessary to make sure that that there was that area of separation around there, and the boundaries were looked at in that context. Yes, sorry, I think that was all on that point. The other, I suppose, the other point to make clear is that whilst there were some representations that Heritage England made earlier in the plans development, they haven't been reiterated in the application work that has come forward and been considered as part of the application.
Yeah, just so I'm clear on one or 2 points. So the area, the other side of the greenbelt, proposed greenbelt land to the west, that's Huntingdon, and the bit to the south of ST8, that's Monk's Cross. Is that right? Okay. When I go there, what will I see to the south of ST8? Is that a residential area or something else?
It's a retail and business park.
You sound surprisingly knowledgeable about the presence of a travel lodge and a McDonald's, Mr. Elvin. So these then are distinct and separate districts, and never the twain should meet.
That's the council's position, yes.
Do they not run into each other already at some point?
The southern boundary will be adjacent with the Monk's Cross retail and employment business park, but there'll be no connection between the residential and the employment uses. They'll be quite separate. And the idea is to keep separate, however, ST8 from the Huntingdon settlement to the west, and prevent that from simply becoming an extension to Huntingdon.
It may be helpful, sir, to have a look. Versions of this plan in a number of places. I currently have it open at Appendix 3 on page 442. And that shows the greenbelt boundaries in that location. And you can see the existing separation north of Monk's Cross with Huntingdon.
Sorry, when we say Monk's Cross, is that this shopping area?
It's the retail.
Or is it a resident? Is there any element of Monk's Cross that's a residential area?
No.
I think if you look at that plan, sir, you can see the boundaries 26 and 27 to the north of Monk's Cross, and then you can see the winding boundary around Huntingdon, 25, 24, 23, etc.
Essentially, so the nearest residential is the eastern boundary of Huntingdon as it goes down at the moment. None of the Monk's Cross boundary is remotely residential. And it's easy, if you need to see it, to visit it.
Mr. Johnson?
Yeah, if I may, sir, I don't want to replay the public inquiry that we had at the beginning of this year, but of the week-long inquiry, almost all of it was spent trying to agree and establish the walking and cycling links between the site and Huntingdon. In effect, the walkability, the 3 routes along North Lane, Garth Road and Woodlands Way, all 3 routes walking back into Huntingdon to make use of the services. This was never a public inquiry. That was the discussion about the settlement of Monk's Cross North. It's a sustainability point. The council were very keen to ensure those trips and those linkages. It would seem now that they're less keen. And I just wonder if we'd like to ask the council now whether it wants those linkages back into Huntington or not, because it seems as if the council's position on this has shifted. Now,
no is the answer.
So we don't wish to remove the walking and cycling links, which are an integral part of this policy, which we agree with. That's why we think this is a sustainable urban extension to Huntington, as opposed to an extension to Monk's Cross North, which, as you rightly point out, is little more than a retail park. So we'd be more than happy to revisit the topic of the description as to how you create a green buffer along the edge. We don't see that this is a point of soundness for the plan. We just don't see the merit of a green belt wedge. Through master planning and design, we can come up with a relatively simple alternative to this.
As an issue, I certainly do see it as one of soundness. A rectifiable issue, depending on what I conclude, but as an issue, it does go to soundness. Yeah, if there needed to be a change, it would be a main modification for soundness reasons.
As I've said, sir, there's no change in our proposed sustainability connections between ST8 and Huntingdon, but just because you've got connections doesn't mean you build around them. And what is being proposed would introduce a lesser range of control over that green wedge to be included in the green belt, and it would effectively extend the settlement as opposed to keep them separate. And that's the issue you're going to have to decide on the soundness point. I'll just draw your attention to the fact that part of that area is an SINC at the southwestern corner, as you'll see from the map.
Forgive my pause. Which I'm going to continue for a moment. Probably my fault entirely, Ms. Brown. Can you run past me again what you say is the purpose of the area of green belt proposed there between the two districts?
It relates to the methodology of implementing Purpose 4 of the 5 purposes of Greenbelt from the MPPF, as the methodology has been agreed for York. That is to create the green wedge in order to provide the setting and the identity between the settlements, in this case in relation to the existing built-up area of Huntingdon. And sir, for your reference, should you wish to come back and dwell on this further, it is the section in the appendix, A3 pages 443 to 444, where that is set out more fully. It actually extends on to page 445 as well.
So in terms of purpose 4, I've just pulled up the MPPF in front of me just to remind myself of the words that are there, rather than just having in my mind my recollection of what they are. Purpose 4, to preserve the setting and special character of historic towns. Well, okay, York is an historic town. What's the special character element here? Or is it a question of any special character here? Or is special character something that is city-wide?
It's a city-wide matter rather than a locally specific matter. So to remind you, the 3 criteria for which Purpose 4 has been defined in relation to York: compactness, landmark monuments, landscape and setting.
And on the landscape and setting, at the end of 445 and top of 446, it also has an element of anti-coalescence, hence the separation from Huntingdon.
But I think it is important to understand it as a citywide land use rather than a local particular issue.
Okay, I understand that point. Mr. Johnson. Oh, sorry, you weren't actually indicating.
No, I wasn't.
I was probably just expecting.
But whilst you just prodded me on that one, is that you will be aware is that there are several allocations around the edge of the city that are urban extensions, and there is no separation. And in this particular case, as I've pointed out, it's 1960s housing that backs on. There's in effect no special character to that boundary or that adjoining land.
Which urban extensions proposed did you have in mind, Mr. Johnson?
But sorry, sir, there are allocations, not urban extensions. So there are allocations that bolt on to the edge of the city.
It comes back to the structural point about York having these sort of fingers of development going out without necessarily having them coalesce. And you can gain that by looking at the proposals map that you've got open, which is what has just been said. It's a structural issue relating to the historic character of York rather than something specific to this location.
Is it a deliberate attempt to create a sort of mini stray, if you like?
It's creating a green wedge in the format that green wedges exist around the city of York, some of which are rings, some of which are strays, some of which don't have that historic association, if you like, and are just seen as green wedges. There is a small version of one at the moment in the area pointed out to the west, and it would be an extension of that to then form to the east of Huntingdon.
I'm now just taking your frowning as an indication that you want to speak, Mr. Johnson.
Yes, sorry, sir. It's just at some points it's 80 metres wide. At what point does a mini straight actually just become a very narrow strip? I genuinely don't get it. But if that's the intention of a mini straight, then it certainly won't. Once built, it certainly won't perform in that way. It'll be just a series of thin bits of land that are just cut off and potentially not well looked after or abused even. It's a missed opportunity, I think, is my final comment.
I just draw your attention to the fact if you go just south of ST8 to Monkstray, you'll see that the area between the settlements as you travel northeast from Monkstray is at least as narrow, if not narrower, than the proposed area between Huntingdon and ST8. The functionality of keeping the fingers of development and not simply filling in the gaps is quite clearly replicated elsewhere, replicating position elsewhere in the city. And we don't think there's another allocation that has any bears any real comparison to ST8 in this respect.
Okay, there nothing else from me on this. I think, Mr. Johnson, you indicated that you'd said what you wanted to. Anything else from the council? Okay, very good. So I can move on to ST9. That's policy SS11. Land north of Haxby. Mr. Elvin?
You have a statement of common ground agreed rather late in the day yesterday, but nonetheless circulated. I'm afraid you got my copy. So it's got my red marking on the front. But, no, I meant it. My copy was reproduced. So matters not agreed. There's some detailed wording issues with regard to open space, but the main issue is relates to the designation of open space under under SS11, and the issue is to what extent that ought to be identified. Our position is that it's not prescriptive, but it is intended to be indicative. It's open to a degree of flexibility. But as I understand it, the promoters don't want it at all and want the flexibility to put open space anywhere within the site or adjacent to it. We see there are good reasons for putting it where it's proposed.
Yeah, so this is the area identified on the policies map, isn't it? Yeah.
And the sorry, as Mr. Henderson prods me, so I've got the wrong one.
No, it's the right one.
I've got it the wrong way up. They all start to swim before the eyes after a while.
Left-hand side.
Oh, yes, so it is. Yes, if you, yeah, no, yeah. Sorry, I was looking at the plan the wrong way around. Yes, the importance of the location, at least in indicative terms, of course, it's serving not only the new settlement, but the existing housing to south, is it south?
Yes.
Yes, south, west and east. So that appears to the council to be an appropriate location for it, though, as I say, the intention is not to be prescriptive, but that seems to us to be the right place to put it. And if you were to put the public open space away from that, it would be less sustainable in terms of serving the local community. And thank you. And Mr. Henderson, who knows all about these things, tells me there's a cemetery adjacent to it. Yeah, yeah, and you'll see that is marked, in fact, in very small type on the proposals map, on the little green crosses over it. So that further strengthens its location in terms of principle. Is that a response to my submissions? Maybe it is.
Yes, I've no idea who the phantom raspberry blower is. I can confirm on this occasion it wasn't me. Mr. Lane.
Thank you, sir. Just on this point, the open space. The first thing is that it separates the proposed development and isolates it from the existing community. It's going to mean that there's greater walking distances towards the settlement centre and the shops and services in it. It also cuts across. If you look on Google Earth, you'll see that this part of the site is crossed by lots of thin, small fields with ditches and mature hedgerows and trees. And to create create your football pitches and cricket pitches in that area is going to mean decimating those hedgerow boundaries, etc. It's far better, in my view, sir, to properly master plan the site. We're not saying that the level of open space is anyway inappropriate, but to have that open space distributed around the site to best incorporate and include the ecology, the trees, the hedgerows, etc., would be far better solution to this than basically just having a wedge between the proposed development and the existing community.
Can I come back on that point? I think the important thing to remember here is that this particular part of open space that we're seeking to achieve is not only to serve the new community that's created on the site, but importantly to serve those residents that form part of the existing community of Haxby. The background to it is that there's demonstrable deficiency of open space and play pitch and recreation provision. This allocation provides an opportunity to improve that situation, and by locating it where it's broadly shown on the allocations map, ensures that it isn't positioned on the peripheral parts of the site, which would not give best connectivity to those people that live to the south of the site. That's the grounds on which the council's proposing.
Would I be right in thinking that you both sort of want the same thing? It's just a question of how you go about it that's at issue.
I think that's probably right, but we don't see that it's sensible to fragment it and just scatter it around. It needs to be located conveniently for both the existing and the new communities. And in terms of access to the existing community and services, well, the open space designation doesn't prevent access points for pedestrians and cyclists going through it. And just, as I say, just bearing in mind that you've already got the Haxby and Wigginton Cemetery just to the west, that will be the new area will be much more convenient for the local community than, say, its existing sports facilities, which in fact are right at the northwestern extremity of the settlement. And so you'll have a better location for open space recreation with the main settlement. And we don't see you're going to obtain that by scattering it around a larger site, effectively.
So I'm just looking at the open space as it is indicated on the policies map, and I do take your point, Mr. Elvin, that that was indicative. I think you said. I wonder if the width of that space is at least similar to the green wedge separating ST8 from Huntingdon, in order to maintain the individual identities of those two places, and whether you might be at risk of achieving the same thing on ST9 when you don't want to.
I'm not convinced that we would here. The relationship that we've discussed on ST8 is a much more linear and longer stray, or from in a north to south direction. What would be achieved here is something that would physically be very different, running east-west, and it wouldn't continue in any way in the length that we were talking about. If you take
Would ST9 as proposed introduce any new home adjacent to an existing one?
Well, I could say it's not impossible. If you look at the eastern end, the indicative edge of the public open space is fairly close to the built urban area, and given it's indicative, there may be scope in terms of master planning to have a less linear edge to the open space, but still maintain the majority of the open space. We're not trying to create a green wedge, we're trying to create something that's accessible and sustainable to both communities.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I'm hearing from you, and in principle, I don't think there's anything entirely between you at all. But I do wonder whether it's the illustration, the indicative illustration on the policies map, that potentially causes more of a problem. I wonder whether you have more flexibility in your mind than that illustration of the policy might suggest.
If I could take you to the matters not agreed, we've suggested an amendment to say the general location of the open space should be determined through the preparation of approval of a master plan. So the policy intention, it's page 7, and it's, oh sorry, that's theirs, sorry, ours is below it. Yeah, sorry, we've said creation of new open space as shown broadly on the policies plan, providing recreation and sports. So there's a similar intention, and we've said broadly, and that makes it clear it's not prescriptive. We don't think that the location should be open to a wide-ranging review, as I've said, but that's not to say that there isn't scope for adjustment along the edges and in general terms to reflect the objectives of both the new housing development and the recreational objectives of the policy. Its objectives are purely to provide a dual facility, not to provide a green wedge.
Yeah, I'm sure it can't be that hard to provide an open space here that both the existing and new communities can gather around. Mr. Lane?
Just very quickly, sir. Yes, the council has moved on their policy through the statement of common ground. It is much more flexible than the previous policy iteration, but it does say it must create a new open space to the south of the site, as broadly shown on the proposal's map, OS9. So it does identify it. So no matter how much we talk about flexibility, the policy is directing all of the open space to be in that southern part of the site known as OS9. And quite frankly, we're not proposing that the open space should be broken up into little chunks. You can't break a cricket field up, for example, into little chunks. But actually, cricket fields and football pitches sometimes can be better accommodated in those fields. There's lots of small fields there, and I think I'm very strongly of the view that actually finding the best location for the sports pitches, for example, would be better done through a master plan and agreeing that master plan than actually saying it should be all at the south, which is the most sensitive part of the site in landscape terms, ecological terms, and all other planning terms.
Mr. Natkus.
Thank you, sir. Similar points, really, and I think for me, you've hit the nail on the head, really, that it is looking to create almost a separate community away from what's there at the moment. I think we've just got to be really careful that we're not using some policies to do other things. And I think when you read the plan as a whole, OS 9, which delineates the new open space, does say indicative, but the policy seeks to provide it as shown on the proposals map. And whilst it says broadly in that location, I think if, say, a couple of rows of homes were to be built immediately adjacent to the existing homes on that road and then the open space, I immediately think all of those people would say that isn't broadly in line with it. I think there might be some little tinkering around the edges with how thick is that line, but I think it does absolutely show what the anticipation would be. And I just think there has to be open space. There is a deficiency in the area, we know. There's a commitment to providing that open space, but it has to be in the right area, and it has to serve the purposes of what it's for, i.e. it's identifying it as sport and recreation. So given the importance of those field boundaries, is it the right location? Equally, it should be overlooked, whatever open space it is, so that we should have not the backs of existing houses looking onto it. It may be that there is a case for a row of homes and then the open space, and I just think the flexibility needs to be there within it. Now, it may be that actually through master planning it ends up being in exactly the same place and we think, what was all the fuss about? But we're almost predetermining it, and it's similar to the point that we made yesterday, that I can't see the evidence from the council as to why the open space should be there, other than them saying we want this to be accessible for the existing residents. Now, I understand that, and I think that we do want to do that, but equally we want to create somewhere that the new residents actually feel part of Haxby and feel integrated into it. And this very much feels like one of those places where you'd have old Haxby and new Haxby and the residents looking across the open space to those new houses and them never really feeling part of the town because you've got this big buffer. And for me, that doesn't make sense. And without evidence to say that is the only place it could go in the best place, I think it should be left for the master plan.
That's a mischaracterisation, because what you will have is dwellings on each side of a recreation space, and what we want to avoid is a situation as with the sports club where it's stuck out away from the existing settlement and is, as you'll say, is at the northwest. If you look at the open space, new open space policy, GI6 171 to 173, it says indicative, and it says the precise delineation and extent will be set through detailed master planning and the planning process. So there is a considerable flexibility built in there, and the ability includes linkages through to existing dwellings. And if I might say so, I don't know whether Mr. Naxis has been here, I'm sure he has, and if you want to look at it, if you go, you'll find a lot of the houses are not just backing onto it, some of them are sideways on, so the idea of it not being overlooked by existing housing is simply incorrect. The houses are orientated in a number of ways, and there are a number of roads which end effectively as cul-de-sacs at the boundary with the open space, with the houses on a north-south alignment rather than an east-west alignment. So the suggestion that it's just going to be looking at the backs of houses isn't actually accurate. And of course that can be checked on a site visit if you think it's essential. There is little between us other than to say we don't want it stuck in the north of the site or something of that description. And we've left it to precise delineation in master planning and planning judgment. We've made it clear it's a broad site. I don't think there's anything else we can say, frankly, that there are good reasons for putting it here and not good reasons for just leaving it up to an argument at the development stage when the suggestion may be that it's put distant from the existing community.
Yeah, I suspect this is one where my site visit may well prove instructive. I don't know if you have any final comments that you wanted to make on that, or indeed is there anything else that we need to talk about this site?
Just on that, sir, on the open space issue, I think we're almost there. I think the council have just agreed that it should be subject to a master plan. Clearly, the council can approve that master plan or not approve that master plan. They have discretion in that. So if they feel that the open space is all being proposed on the edge of the settlement, they can not approve that master plan, and we're back to square one, designing it again. It's just that green area, an OS9, how it's shown on the plan, there would be a reasonable expectation that the local residents would be expecting that open space to go there rather than anywhere else. I think we're almost there on that point, sir. But the other point on the open space issue is the requirement to liaise with the parish council, the town council, the neighbourhood planning group and the local residents. Now clearly that would take place as part of any community involvement, but the inference on the policy is something more than actually consulting them as part of community engagement. It's almost inferring that we need to get their agreement to what they might want, and then we're going to have a whole wish list of bowls courts, bowling alleys, swimming pools, etc. I think it's just an unnecessary reference because that would take place in any event, sir.
It says liaising with, it doesn't say in agreement with, which is not enforceable and wouldn't be a legitimate policy. It is flagging up that because it's a community facility, it's flagging up that there needs to be specific consultation with those bodies. You'll see that it's under 3.22 on page 7. As for master planning, it's already in the policy, page 173. And we do think it's legitimate that residents should be able to say, well, the general location is here, even if it can be adjusted and the housing can be designed and the recreation space can be designed in a way which doesn't follow it slavishly.
And just to follow that, to make clear that one of the amendments to that wording now includes that the list of uses may, or it's a may include rather than a specific requirement to include those uses as listed in the submitted version. So,
forgive me, I'm failing to multitask. If you could say that again.
So in the same location of the Statement of Common Ground, where we've proposed the council's favoured wording, which is an additional revision to what we've previously said, we've accepted the point that has just been made around the list of uses in the policy and added flexibility by saying this may include rather than as it was originally worded, which said including, which just to make it clearer that it's a possibility for some of those, but it's not an absolute prescribed list of uses.
Sorry, it just occurs to me, because one of the inclusive uses is an extension or cemeteries and allotments. If you're extending the cemetery, then it makes sense to put it in the general location of the existing one.
Anything else on this? Are you indicating, Mr. Natkus?
I am, sir, and I've just got a couple of other very quick points. So just to finish on the open space, the point earlier about the overlooking, I'll correct what I said. It's either the back of houses not looking over it, or it's blank gables not looking over it. The ends of those properties on the cul-de-sacs that were mentioned don't have windows in them, so it isn't overlooked. The point I want to make, though, is we've got to look at the plan as a whole. And I'm grateful for the council's amendment to include or, because previously it did feel like everything had to be provided. But OS 9, which is the allocation or designation of that open space, explicitly states that it should be new recreation and sports provision to the south of ST9. So to me, there's a conflict between OS 9 and the detailed allocation of this, because one of them says it has to be sports provision and recreation, but then this says that it may also need to include allotments and other aspects of it. Now, it might be something when we come onto the OS 9, I don't know if that's in the next phase, that needs to be updated to bring it in line, but I think the two do have to be the same, because when we come to put an application in it, it has to deal with it. And I think I completely agree. If there's going to be an extension to the cemetery, you'd put it next to it. Absolutely, it makes sense. And equally, if there's going to be some allotments, it makes sense for them to go there because of that field pattern. But it's the sports and playing fields that don't.
Mr. Nankus, I think you're pushing at an open door on so far as the description in OS 9 in GI 6 is concerned. That clearly needs just to refer to the location and not to the uses. That will be appropriate to include, as we've agreed, in the allocation policy. So we agree that OS 9 ought to be made to conform.
Well, if that's correct and that's going to change, then I think we might actually need to do anything else, because underneath that it then says this new open space will be complemented by further on-site provision, which would then perhaps give the flexibility for sports pitches to go elsewhere on the site. But that's just then when the scale of the open space to the bottom needs to be included in master planning. Again, it just further complicates it. So I think there is a solution to it, but if that amendment's made, reading OS 9 and SS11 together, but without saying the area has to be that big, would probably work. The other two quick points that I just wanted to flag are the fact that the opening requirement for this site is with regards to the design quality, and it's just the elevation of this site amongst many of the other allocations in terms of the design quality having to be a high design standard, which is something that doesn't appear on others. Now, I'm not saying that we don't want to do something that's of a high design standard, because the council have development management policies that will deal with that, and any design would have to be dealt with it. But it's just a tricky one for when you look at a planning application, because if we did a scheme here that was broadly similar to, say, the site we were discussing yesterday, ST7, it would be very simple for somebody to say, well, hang on a minute, this is exactly the same. By high design standard, the council clearly wants something elevated from the other sites. What does this site do? And I think we've just got to be really careful when we start putting adjectives like that in, that it's really difficult to actually deal with, well, how is it high or not? Because there will be policies that require a good level of design. And it does imply that this site should have a better quality than other sites, but I can't find any evidence as to why that would be the case. And I'm not sure if it's intended to be. And then the final point is just on the local facilities, which again, it may be that the council can clarify this, but where the site is probably closer to all of the other facilities in Haxby than large parts of Haxby itself. All of the facilities are in the northern part. There's the main road, and you'll go yourself and do the site visit and see them. And I would suggest that actually this site doesn't actually need, well, it clearly doesn't need a shop or a butcher's or a doctor's or any of those facilities, because they all exist at the moment, and they all exist within very easy walking distance from this site. So to start putting other facilities on here would actually be inaccessible to a large amount of people within Haxby, and actually most people would use the main street. If it was towards the southern end, I'd absolutely get the requirement for it, because it's quite a distance away from them, but just given its location, I don't think it needs anything else on site, and we just need to make sure that this policy requirement doesn't specify that it must do. I know the council have added in viability, but I'm not sure whether that should be included or not. So I think Mr. Lane's option was to put viability in, but I just personally think that there isn't any evidence that suggests it does need anything because of the facilities that exist at the moment.
Just on the back of that specific point on requiring additional facilities, accept the point that Haxby has a great range of shops and facilities as it stands at the moment. What we're trying to do here is ensure that there is sufficient flexibility, and through the design process it may be appropriate to incorporate some units that could be designed and in a more flexible way to accommodate small-scale business uses. At the end of the day, this is quite a substantial allocation for over 700 homes. It's not a small area that allocation that we're talking about. So to see it as entirely residential, I think is perhaps a little of a narrow viewpoint. I think it would be reasonable to assume that something might be capable of coming forward on a small scale, and we wouldn't want to lose that opportunity. On the matter of design and the provision that is in the policy, in this one on high quality design, or high standard of design, sorry, it is repeated in other policies in the plan. In fact, we dealt with some of those yesterday, and they weren't contested by promoters of those sites. Here we've got a site at the edge of a village in an arguably sensitive location. It demands a standard of design.
I'll just be clear on that. Does it? I don't want to go through all the policies to see if they all say that. I just take a consistent approach. Either it should be in the allocation policies, or otherwise abandon it in the allocation policies and leave it to another plan policy.
Yeah.
I don't want to be arguing this kind of thing as we go through other sites as well. Let's just have a consistent approach.
Okay, yeah, we're satisfied that it's covered by DM1 particularly, and of course, yeah, and the design guide and the associated material around that.
So I take that as a proposed main modification to delete criterion I.
Yes, which we would apply where it occurred in other policies too on that basis then. I think there's 3.
Mr. Lane, are we getting close to finishing?
Very, very quick point. Thank you for the clarification on criteria I. It's in relation to the 4th criteria. It's just the word as required. I just think as required, the council could require something, or the locals could have a legitimate expectation that the council are going to require some retail facilities, etc., on this site. So I just needs, I've suggested subject to viability as a suitable way to demonstrate that they're not required. That's my suggestion, sir. I think there's merit in that, but obviously that's down to you and the council.
I have to say, this is a minor, probably drafting issue, but that wording did grate with me slightly. It's not a big point. Okay, in my notebook, Mr. Elvin, I have put, and tell me if I've got this wrong because I'll have to change it, a proposed modification from the council, whether it's main or otherwise, I can think about in due course, but that deletes. Where's it gone? The delete as required and potentially replaces it with something else, possibly as appropriate. Appropriate local facilities, yeah. But I'll leave that with you. Are you indicating, Mr. Lane, for the last time? Okay, very good. Was there anything else from your end of the table? Marvellous. Anything else from the council on this site? Very good. In which case I will adjourn for the day, unless there's anything else we need to pick up on beforehand. Okay, very good. In which case I make it 16:37. Adjourn the hearing to resume tomorrow morning at 9:30. Thank you.
And we're now caught up, which is good. Thank you.
And thank you as well to all concerned having the flexibility to come back this afternoon to talk about these two sites. Appreciated.